There comes a moment in every strong person's life when they realize no one is clapping for them. No one is coming to check in. No one is asking, how are you holding up? And the people they sacrifice for, they're still asking for more. You ever feel like you're the one who's always there? For birthdays, for breakdowns, for bailouts, you show up, you give, you fix, you pour, over and over, until you're running on fumes, until your own reflection feels like a stranger. And you wonder, when did I become invisible in my own life? This isn't about resentment. It's not about playing the victim. It's about waking up to a truth that most people don't want to admit. You train them to expect you to bleed silently, and the moment you stop, they call it attitude, they call it selfishness. But let's be clear, choosing yourself is not betrayal, it's survival. This is about the man who finally looked around after giving everything to everyone and realized, if I don't choose myself now, I'll disappear for good. You want to know what happens when a man decides he's done being the background character in his own story? You're about to find out. Because this is the moment he stopped breaking for people who wouldn't even bend for him. He was the strong one, the dependable one, the one who held it all together when everything else was falling apart. People came to him not because they loved him deeply, but because they knew he would show up, no matter what. He gave without expecting applause. He sacrificed without needing recognition. At first it felt noble, purposeful, like maybe that was his role in the world. To be the anchor, the protector, the provider, the fixer. So he leaned in. He gave more. Time, energy, money, effort. His whole identity became wrapped around being who everyone else needed him to be. He said yes, even when he wanted to say no. He stood up for others when no one stood up for him. He listened to stories that drained him, solved problems that weren't his, and carried weights no one else even noticed. And in doing all of that, piece by piece, he was erasing himself. People admired his strength. They praised his reliability. But no one asked what it was costing him. No one wondered how much pressure it took to keep being the strong one. Every single day, he could be bleeding internally, but as long as he kept smiling and showing up, the world would never know. He had mastered the art of appearing fine, even when he was quietly crumbling. You could see him laughing in a room full of people, and yet feel how empty his eyes were if you looked closely enough. But most never did. And slowly his life became a one-way street. He poured into others, but no one poured into him. He remembered birthdays, showed up for emergencies, answered late-night calls, lent money, gave advice, helped people rebuild their lives. And when the tables turned, when he needed help, silence, excuses, disappearances. Suddenly, everyone was too busy or going through something. That was the moment it hit him. Not everyone loves like he does. Not everyone gives back what they take. And the hardest pill to swallow, most people aren't even aware they're draining you. They're just used to you saying yes to being their lifeline. But the truth is, he didn't speak up. He didn't set boundaries. He didn't say, this is too much for me. Because deep down, he believed his worth was tied to what he could do for others. He thought love was earned through sacrifice. That being a good man meant putting himself last. So he kept giving even when his body was exhausted, even when his mind was screaming for rest, even when his soul felt hollow. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was emotional starvation. He started to forget what he even liked to do, what made him laugh, what made him feel alive. He had spent so long being everything for everyone else that he forgot who he was before the world started asking so much of him. And it's subtle how that kind of giving wears you down. It doesn't happen overnight. It's death by 1,000 small cuts. You start feeling numb. You lose interest in things you once loved. You don't look forward to anything. You're tired all the time, not just sleep deprived, but spiritually tired. Tired in your bones. And even then, he kept showing up because he didn't want to let people down, because he didn't want to be that guy who stopped caring. But inside, he was burning out, fading, becoming a ghost in his own story. Every time he said yes to someone else, he was saying no to himself, no to rest, no to his dreams, no to his peace. And eventually something inside him whispered, this isn't sustainable. It took hitting that silent wall, the kind where There's no audience, no crisis, no big event, just a quiet, empty moment of realization. He was giving everything, but to everyone else, and no one was giving back. And that kind of imbalance isn't noble, it's dangerous. You can't be the foundation for everyone else's house while your own roof is caving in. He started to recognize that giving isn't always a virtue when it comes at the cost of your identity. That loyalty doesn't mean losing yourself. That love should feel like support, not obligation. He realized that the people who truly care for you would never want you to drain yourself dry for them, that real relationships are about reciprocity, not rescue missions. And the moment he admitted that, the moment he allowed himself to feel the weight of his own exhaustion, that was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where he would learn to pour into himself first, where he would begin to rebuild not for others but for himself. Because he finally understood this. You can give people the best of you without giving them all of you. He gave until he was empty, but he wouldn't stay that way. Not anymore. At some point you start to notice who's not there. Not when the lights are on, not when the crowd's around, not when things are easy, but when life goes quiet, when things fall apart. When you're the one who's struggling, when you're the one with the unanswered questions, the sleepless nights, the silent breakdowns, that's when you begin to see the truth. He had been the rock for so long that everyone forgot he could crumble too. People assumed he didn't need help, or maybe they just didn't care to ask. They were used to seeing him as unshakable, and so they never paused to think, what if he's tired too? And he was more than tired. He was drained, discouraged, and dangerously close to shutting down. He had built a life around showing up for others, always ready, always reliable. But the day came when the storm hit his life. And this time, there was no one standing in the rain for him. No one knocking on his door to check in. No one sending that late-night text that says, I've got you, just silence. And it wasn't the kind of silence that feels peaceful. It was the kind that screams, the kind that makes you realize you've been surrounded by people who only know how to take the kind of silence that exposes every empty relationship, every one-sided friendship, every connection that was built on your usefulness, not your worth. He waited for someone to show up the way he always had. He waited for someone to say, I see you're not okay. Let me carry this with you. But no one came, not because he wasn't valuable, not because he wasn't loved, but because people had grown comfortable with him being the one who never needed anything. And here's the brutal truth. When you play the role of the strong one for too long, people stop seeing you as human. They forget that the strongest people also bleed. They forget that the most generous hearts often ache in silence. He had spent years teaching everyone how to treat him. He never asked for help, so they stopped offering it. He made it look easy, so they assumed it was. And in that loneliness, a new kind of clarity was born. He saw how much he had depended on others to validate his value, how deeply he had hoped anyone would save him, that someone would notice when he was at his breaking point. But no one did, and while that hurt, it was also the turning point. Because the longer he sat in that quiet despair, the more he realized maybe no one's coming, maybe this is it, maybe I have to save myself. Not because he wasn't worthy of help, but because the truth was simple. No one can save you the way you can save yourself. So he stopped waiting. He stopped hoping someone would see the pain behind his eyes or ask about the weight he carried. He began to understand that his healing, his peace, his next chapter, it wouldn't come from anyone else's effort. It had to come from him. The world doesn't stop just because you're tired. People don't always pause to notice when you're not okay. And the moment you accept that, not in bitterness, but in truth, you become powerful, because then your strength isn't borrowed. It's not dependent on anyone else showing up. It's yours, built from the ground up. He got up quietly, without applause, without support, without a rescue. He faced himself in the mirror, hollow, exhausted, but still here. And he made a decision that changed everything. He would stop expecting others to rescue a version of him they never even truly saw. He would stop hoping to be saved by people who didn't have the capacity to understand what he needed. He would stop waiting for someone to hand him back the life he lost while carrying everyone else's burdens. And this wasn't a declaration of war against the world. It wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an awakening, a realization that the only person who could truly protect him, rebuild him, and elevate him was the person staring back in the mirror. So he started slow. He drew lines where there used to be access. He said no where he used to say yes. He began to listen to himself more than others. He began to put himself first, not out of selfishness, but out of necessity. So no one came to save him, but he learned to stand, and in standing, he discovered something he'd never known before. He didn't need to be rescued. He needed to remember who he was. Pain became his teacher. Silence became his sanctuary. And loneliness became the mirror that revealed everyone who was only there for the benefits of him, not the being of him. So he moved different. He let go of the need to explain himself. He stopped shrinking to be acceptable. He no longer overextended just to avoid disappointing others. He gave himself the same love, loyalty, and effort he had poured into the world. And in that journey, he didn't just survive, he started to live on his own terms, with his own strength, with a heart no longer defined by how much it could endure, but by how deeply it could protect itself. Because no one came to save him, so he did it himself. And that made all the difference. It didn't happen overnight. It rarely does. Change is never a lightning bolt. It's a slow burn. And for him, it started with a whisper, a quiet voice deep inside that said, "You're allowed to stop." At first, he ignored it. He had spent years operating on default. Take care of others. Push your needs aside. Be strong. Don't complain. Don't make noise. But the whisper got louder, not in words, but in fatigue, in irritability, in that hollow ache in his chest that wouldn't go away. Something was off. He knew it. He just didn't know what to do about it. That whisper eventually became a question. When was the last time you chose yourself? It rattled him, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he did. He couldn't remember. He couldn't remember the last time he made a decision that wasn't about keeping someone else comfortable. He couldn't remember the last time he prioritized his mental peace over someone else's approval. His days were filled with obligations, his nights with overthinking, and his identity had become a reflection of everyone's expectations, but never his own truth. Then came the realization that changed everything. No one was going to give him permission to choose himself. He had to take it. And it wasn't some dramatic movie scene, no fireworks, no big speech, just one small decision. He said no to something he would have usually said yes to, not out of spite, but because he genuinely didn't want to do it. He didn't have the energy, he didn't have the interest, and when he said no, something strange happened. The world didn't end. The people he was afraid of disappointing, they adjusted. The chaos he was bracing for never came, and that's when he realized just how much of his life had been built around unnecessary guilt. So he made another decision, and then another. He stopped answering calls that always drained him. He stopped justifying his boundaries. He stopped apologizing for resting. He stopped explaining himself to people who had already made up their minds about who he was supposed to be. The more he chose himself, the louder the resistance got, not just from others, but from within. The guilt showed up, the fear of being seen as selfish, the anxiety of disappointing others. It all tried to pull him back into the old version of himself, the overgiver, the peacemaker, the silent sufferer. But he held the line. He reminded himself again and again that choosing yourself doesn't mean you don't care about others. It just means you're finally including yourself in the equation. And it was messy. Don't let anyone fool you into thinking growth is neat and organized. It wasn't some smooth upward journey. He stumbled, he second-guessed, he had moments where he almost picked up the phone and fell back into old patterns. But he didn't, because deep down, he knew that if he didn't do this now, if he didn't learn to honor his needs, his peace, his values, he would lose himself for good. He started waking up and checking in with himself first. Not his emails, not his messages, not other people's problems, just himself. What do I need today? What do I want to feel? What do I want to create? It felt foreign at first, selfish even, but slowly it became sacred. He relearned the art of listening to his gut. He started spending time alone, not out of loneliness, but out of love. He started writing again, walking without his phone, saying, I'll think about it instead of yes, out of pressure. And with each decision, he felt pieces of himself coming back. Not a new version of him, but the version that always existed underneath the performance. People noticed, some didn't like it. They missed the old version of him, the one who was always available, always agreeable, always saying sure with a tired smile. He heard the passive comments. You've changed, you're distant, you're different now. And he was, but not because he had become bitter, because he had become clear. He had spent too long mistaking being needed for being loved, but now he was choosing to be respected, to be valued, to be whole. He had stopped negotiating his worth in exchange for belonging. He no longer feared walking away from people who expected him to stay broken just to keep the peace. This wasn't about closing off. It was about coming home to the version of himself that knew his own limits, that wasn't afraid to protect his space, that understood peace was more important than being liked, that realized saying no was sometimes the most loving thing you could do for yourself and others. The decision to choose himself wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't about proving anything, it was quiet, steady, and it came from a place of finally understanding you don't have to sacrifice your soul to be seen as good. He didn't stop being kind, he didn't stop caring, but he stopped betraying himself in the name of loyalty. And that changed everything. Because when a man decides to choose himself, not in arrogance, not in ego, but in truth, he doesn't just change his own life. He sets the tone for how everyone else will treat him from that moment on. Starting over sounds poetic until you're the one doing it. The idea of rebuilding yourself feels inspiring until you're sitting in the ruins of everything you used to be, trying to piece together a version of you that no longer fits the mold others put you in. That's when you learn something most people never talk about. Healing is not pretty. It's not graceful. It's not a straight line. It's brutal. It will rip open everything you buried just to make others comfortable. He thought that once he chose himself, things would get easier, that somehow the weight would lift and clarity would flood in. But what met him instead was silence, isolation, the discomfort of sitting alone with all the noise he had been avoiding. There was no guidebook, no applause, no one to cheer him on, just him and the truth. And that's the first part of rebuilding. It's lonely. Not because you're unworthy of people, but because growth separates you from what you've outgrown. Suddenly, the conversations you used to tolerate feel shallow. The people you used to bend for now feel unfamiliar. The roles you used to play, they feel suffocating. And that disconnection hurts. But it's necessary because you can't build something new while still standing in the ashes of your old identity. He had to unlearn years of conditioning. He had to question everything. Why did he feel guilty for resting? Why did he feel obligated to explain himself every time he said no? Why was he so uncomfortable with peace, with stillness, with the idea that he didn't need to be useful to be loved? Every question led him deeper into himself, and the deeper he went, the more he saw the cost of who he had been pretending to be. There were days when the weight of that truth felt unbearable, days when he questioned if he was doing the right thing, when the old version of himself whispered, "It was easier back then, wasn't it?" And in some ways it was. It was easier to say yes than to deal with conflict, easier to avoid your own needs than to admit you were hurting, easier to be liked than to be authentic. But easy doesn't mean right, and he was done choosing comfort over truth. So he kept going, kept showing up for himself, even when it didn't feel productive, even when it felt selfish. He learned that rebuilding isn't about doing more. It's about being more present with yourself. He started small, a morning walk, journaling instead of numbing out, choosing silence over meaningless noise. He started to trust his own voice again, the one he had silenced for so long, the one that said you're allowed to take up space. But it wasn't all quiet reflection. Rebuilding also meant confrontation. He had to confront his patterns, his habits, the people he had allowed too much access. He had to face uncomfortable conversations where he stood firm on his boundaries and risked being misunderstood. He had to endure the sting of people falling away when he stopped playing the role they liked him in. And that hurt deeply. But he realized something powerful. When people leave because you stopped breaking yourself for them, they were never truly with you to begin with. In the midst of all that pain, though, something beautiful began to emerge. Clarity. Clarity about what actually mattered, about what peace felt like. It wasn't flashy or loud. It was quiet mornings with no guilt. It was friendships rooted in mutual respect. It was being able to sit with himself without needing to escape. That was the beauty he had been missing while living life in survival mode. And as he kept rebuilding, something shifted. He no longer needed to be everything to everyone. He no longer felt responsible for managing people's emotions at the expense of his own. He no longer saw solitude as punishment, but as a sacred place where he could breathe freely. His world got smaller, but it got more real. He started to laugh again, not the forced kind, but real, unfiltered joy. He started creating, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He started forming relationships where he was seen, not just used, where he could say, I can't give that right now, and still be respected. He learned to live from a place of wholeness, not performance. And here's the truth most people don't tell you. When you start rebuilding, your life gets messier before it gets better, but eventually you stop chasing validation. You stop over-explaining. You stop apologizing for simply existing. You begin to embody the kind of quiet power that only comes from knowing who you are without needing to be told. The process will cost you. It will cost you comfort, approval, sometimes relationships, but what you gain in return is something no one can take from you. A grounded, self-respecting, unapologetic version of yourself. That's the brutal beauty of rebuilding. It breaks you to build you. It isolates you to introduce you to yourself. And once you meet that version of you, the one who doesn't shrink, who doesn't settle, who doesn't sell himself short, there's no going back. Something changes in a person when they've been to the edge and decided not to fall, not because they were rescued, not because someone pulled them back, but because they reached that ledge, looked down, and said, no, not like this. That's what he did. He faced the darkness, sat with the silence, endured the weight of being unseen, unheard, and misunderstood. And instead of breaking, he rebuilt. Slowly, silently, relentlessly, until one day he stood up, not just healed, but unshakable. He didn't announce his comeback. He didn't seek revenge or try to prove anyone wrong. He just got clear on who he was, clear on what he would never tolerate again, clear on the fact that he didn't need to be everything to everyone to be worthy of peace. Where there used to be insecurity, there was now conviction. He no longer chased acceptance. He no longer bent himself to fit the version of him others preferred. He walked into rooms knowing he belonged, not because of status, not because of approval, but because he had finally approved of himself. You could feel the shift in his presence. He didn't speak to impress anymore. He didn't over-explain, didn't overshare, didn't overextend. His energy was quiet but undeniable. Because when a man becomes unshakable, he stops performing. He stops proving. He stops panicking over things that used to keep him up at night. He didn't react like he used to. Chaos didn't pull him out of character. People's opinions didn't sway his direction. He stopped negotiating with guilt, stopped compromising with fear. He had battled his demons in private, and that kind of war changes how you walk through the world. People around him noticed. Some called it distance, some called it arrogance, but what they were really seeing was self-respect. He no longer had the need to be understood by those who only valued him when he was useful. He didn't hold grudges, but he remembered who stood silent when he was sinking, and now he had no space left for those who once drained him. He became unshakable because he stopped outsourcing his identity. He stopped looking for his value in how many people needed him, liked him, or agreed with him. He found his worth in something deeper, his own peace, his own truth. And that kind of self-connection, it's rare, it's real, it's rooted. His boundaries became non-negotiable. He didn't set them to punish anyone. He set them to protect the peace he fought so hard to earn. People either rose to meet his new standard or they walked away. And he didn't chase either outcome, because when you're grounded in who you are, you don't fear loss, you honor alignment. The man who used to say yes out of fear now said no with clarity. The man who once stayed silent to keep the peace now spoke with precision. The man who once ran to fix everyone else now made sure his own foundation stayed firm, not cold, not distant, just clear, intentional, present. His strength was no longer loud, it didn't need to be. It lived in how he moved, in how he didn't panic when people left, in how he didn't beg to be chosen, in how he carried himself like someone who had finally decided, I am not a backup plan, I am not an emotional dumping ground, I am not an afterthought, I am not here to bleed quietly while others applaud my sacrifice. He became the kind of man who loved without losing himself, who gave without going empty, who helped without being used. He showed up just not at the expense of his sanity. He loved deeply, just not from a place of desperation. He gave generously, just not to people who made it a transaction. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't tired from constantly being available. He was energized from finally being aligned. His days were no longer spent managing other people's chaos. His mind was no longer cluttered with the fear of judgment. His soul wasn't suffocating under the pressure to please. Now he woke up with direction, he moved with purpose, he rested without guilt, he worked without losing sight of himself, and most importantly, he knew that peace didn't come from control, it came from release. He let go of the need to be liked, to be needed, to be everything to everyone, and in that surrender, he found everything he had been looking for. He became unshakable not because life got easier, but because he got stronger. Because he stopped trying to survive in environments that drained him. Because he finally realized that healing isn't just about feeling better, it's about remembering your worth and never again settling for less than that. The storm still came. Life didn't get perfect, but he wasn't rattled by every gust of wind. He wasn't destroyed by every setback. He had roots now, deep ones, built from experience, from loss, from solitude, from truth. And when you've built yourself up from rock bottom with nothing but grit and grace, there's not a storm in this world that can take you down. He's not bitter, he's not hard, he's not unkind. He's just no longer available to people who want his fire, but not his flame. No longer available to the life that asked him to be everything but himself. That's what it means to be unshakable. Not untouched by pain, but unafraid of it. Because now he knows he can rise from it, and he will. Every single time. He didn't ask for applause. He didn't need validation. He simply made a choice, one that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. He chose himself, not because he stopped loving others, but because he finally understood that he was worthy of the same love, energy, and respect he had so freely given away for years. This isn't about ego. It's about survival. It's about waking up one day and realizing if I don't fight for myself, no one else will. It's about drawing a line in the sand and saying, this is where I stop bleeding for people who won't even hand me a bandage. It's about learning that peace is not something you find. It's something you build when you stop betraying yourself. And now he stands taller, speaks clearer, lives freer. He walks through the world without fear of being misunderstood because he's done abandoning himself just to be accepted by others. He's not trying to fit in anymore. He's focused on standing strong in who he really is. That's the man he became, a man who no longer begs to be seen, a man who no longer fears being alone, a man who knows if choosing myself makes me the villain in someone else's story, so be it. Because at the end of the day, your power begins the moment you decide, I will never abandon myself again. That is where real strength lives, that is where freedom begins, and that is the man who can no longer be shaken.